A billionaire CEO gets a call from a foreign number. Sir, why does my mom cry every time she sees your picture? The man pauses, his mind racing, only to freeze in utter shock at what the boy at the end of the line says next. Daniel Morris leaned back in his leather chair, the skyline of New York stretching out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his neatly combed hair as he reviewed the final terms of the acquisition. This deal was set to solidify his legacy, another triumph in a career defined by ambition and power. The phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He frowned at the unfamiliar foreign number flashing on the screen. Normally, he'd ignore it. His assistant would handle anything pressing, and unknown numbers rarely warranted his attention. But something about this call gnawed at him, a gut instinct he couldn't quite shake. He picked up the receiver and answered briskly. "This is Daniel Morris." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a small, hesitant voice. "Sir, why does my mom cry every time she sees your picture?" The words hit Daniel like a slap, his professional composure momentarily cracking. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The boy hesitated, then said, "My name is Matteo. I saw your picture on the news. Mom has one just like it in her drawer. She cries when she looks at it. I wanted to know why." Daniel froze, his mind racing. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but the boy's voice had a peculiar weight to it, a strange mix of innocence and accusation that unnerved him. "Matteo," he began cautiously, "how did you get this number?" "I looked it up online," Matteo replied, his tone matter-of-fact, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You're famous. Everyone knows who you are." Daniel leaned back, trying to mask the unease creeping into his chest. "Where is your mother?" he asked, his voice now measured, almost cold. "Does she know you're calling me?" "She's at work. I didn't tell her," Matteo admitted. Daniel felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The name Matteo and the mention of his mother stirred something deep in his memory, a name, a face, a fleeting connection buried under years of calculated indifference. A decade ago, on a business trip to Barcelona, there had been a woman. Bianca. He closed his eyes, willing the memories to stay buried. The affair had been brief, a moment of weakness in an otherwise disciplined life. He'd convinced himself it was insignificant, a distraction that didn't deserve a second thought once he returned home. But now, the voice on the other end of the line made that past feel dangerously close, alive in a way he wasn't prepared for. "Matteo," Daniel said carefully. "What's your mother's name?" "Bianca," the boy replied without hesitation. Daniel's breath caught. His mind painted a vivid picture of Bianca, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, the way her laughter had lit up the small cafe where they'd first met. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, mingling with disbelief. It couldn't be true. Could it? The boy's voice pulled him back. "Do you know her? Did you make her cry?" Daniel swallowed hard. His instinct was to deny everything, to hang up and forget this call ever happened. But the crack in Matteo's voice, the hint of pain wrapped in curiosity, held him back. He had to know the truth. "Matteo," he began, his voice softening. "How old are you?" "I'm 9, the boy replied. 9. Daniel did the math in his head, and the timeline lined up too perfectly. He felt his throat tighten, the walls of his office seeming to close in around him. The deal, the board meetings, the weight of his empire, all of it suddenly felt distant and irrelevant. "Listen to me, Matteo," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "I need you to do something for me. Don't tell your mom you called me. Can you do that?" Matteo hesitated, but then he said, "Okay. But will you tell me why she cries?" Daniel didn't have an answer. "I'll call you back," he said instead, his tone firmer now. "And don't call me again until I do. Promise me." "Okay," Matteo whispered, and the line went dead. Daniel sat there in silence, the phone still in his hand. The world outside his office carried on, horns blaring in the distance, voices murmuring in the hallway. But everything felt muted, as though he were watching it all through frosted glass. He set the phone down slowly and rubbed his temples. This couldn't be real. Yet the boy's voice echoed in his mind, as did the memories he tried to suppress for so long. He thought of Bianca, the way she looked at him with such trust, unaware of the man he truly was, an ambitious, married businessman who'd walked away without a second thought. And now, a decade later, that choice was catching up to him in a way he never could have anticipated. He glanced at the framed photo of his wife, Julia, on his desk. Guilt gnawed at him, but he shoved it aside. First, he needed answers. He picked up his phone again, this time calling a trusted private investigator. "Find out everything you can about a woman named Bianca living in Barcelona," he instructed. "And see if she has a son named Matteo. I need to know if it's true." Hanging up, Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the city skyline. For the first time in his career, he felt truly unmoored. The acquisition, the deal, the endless pursuit of success, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what he might have left behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the office in shadows, Daniel allowed himself to confront the question that had been buried beneath his ambition for years. What kind of man had he become, and could he ever make amends for the life he might have abandoned? Daniel sat in his office long after the sun had set, the city lights flickering in the distance like tiny reminders of the life he'd built. The conversation with Matteo replayed in his mind, looping endlessly, each repetition making it harder to deny what deep down he already knew. The timeline, the boy's age, Bianca's name, everything fit too perfectly. The carefully constructed walls around his past were crumbling, and for the first time in years, he didn't know how to stop it. He glanced at his phone, hoping for an update from the investigator he had hired, but there was nothing yet. The waiting gnawed at him, leaving him restless and agitated. He thought about calling Bianca directly, demanding answers, but what would he even say? "Did you have my child and never tell me?" No. He needed proof first, something concrete before he shattered the fragile life he'd built with Julia. Julia. The thought of her made his chest tighten. She had always been his rock, the one person who saw past his wealth and ambition to the man beneath. But now, he felt a growing distance between them, something she had clearly noticed. Over the past 2 days he had barely spoken, spending more time lost in his thoughts than attending to the things that once seemed so important. At home that evening, Julia sat across from him at the dinner table, her eyes searching his face. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "You've been different lately. Distant. What's going on?" Daniel shifted in his seat, staring at his plate. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on his chest, but he wasn't ready. "Not yet. Just work," he said, forcing a tired smile. "The acquisition has been demanding." Julia studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, though the doubt lingered in her eyes. "You're sure that's all?" she asked gently. "Yeah," he lied, pushing his food around his plate. "It's nothing I can't handle." But Julia wasn't convinced. Later that night, as Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzed with a message from his investigator. He sat up, heart pounding, and opened the file. Matteo Martin. 9 years old. Mother, Bianca Martin. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he scrolled through the report. Photos of Bianca flooded the screen, older now but unmistakable. And then, there was Matteo. The boy's face stared back at him, wide-eyed and curious. The resemblance was undeniable, his eyes, the shape of his mouth, even the way his brow furrowed in thought. His son. The realization settled in his gut like a lead weight. The walls he'd built to contain his past couldn't hold anymore. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. There was no avoiding it. Julia had to know. The next morning, Julia watched him with suspicion over breakfast. When Daniel set down his coffee, his hands trembled slightly. "Julia," he said carefully, "I need to talk to you." She put down her fork, instantly wary. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words before they even left his lips. I got a call. From a boy. He says he's my son. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia's face paled, her eyes widening in shock before narrowing in disbelief. What? She whispered, as if she hadn't heard him right. His name is Matteo. He's 9 years old. His mother's name is Bianca. I met her years ago, before. He trailed off, feeling the words choke him. Before us. Julia's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her face hardening. And you're telling me this now? After how many years? Her voice cracked, anger and hurt colliding in every syllable. I didn't know, Julia, Daniel said quickly, leaning forward. I swear to you, I had no idea. I thought it was just a fling, something that ended when I came back. I never imagined. Julia stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. And what exactly do you expect me to do with this, Daniel? She demanded, her voice rising. Do you want me to pretend this isn't happening? That you don't have a child with another woman? I don't know, Daniel admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I don't know what to do. But I had to tell you. Julia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I need space, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this right now. She left the room before he could say another word, leaving Daniel alone at the table with nothing but his guilt and the growing emptiness between them. That evening, as he sat in his study nursing a drink, his phone buzzed again. A message from Matteo. Are you coming? Daniel stared at the screen, the weight of Julia's heartbreak still pressing on him. But the boy on the other end of the line deserved answers too. He booked a flight to Barcelona. 2 days later, Daniel stood in the airport terminal, staring out at the unfamiliar city skyline beyond the glass. The memories of his last trip here were faint, blurred by time and his own efforts to forget. But they were coming back now, sharper than ever. He checked his watch. Bianca would be meeting him soon, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely unsure of himself. He wasn't the man who had walked away a decade ago. He had built a life of success and structure. But now, standing on the edge of a truth he couldn't escape, he wondered if all of it had been an illusion. When Bianca finally arrived, she stood a few feet away, hesitating before approaching. Time had changed her, but she was still the same woman he remembered, strong, graceful, and with eyes that held too many emotions at once. Daniel, she said quietly, searching his face for answers he wasn't sure he had. He nodded, swallowing hard. Bianca. He paused, looking for the right words. I need to see him. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Come on, she said, turning toward the exit. He's been waiting. Daniel followed, his pulse racing. For the first time in his life, he wasn't walking into a boardroom, a negotiation, or a deal to be made. He was walking toward a son he never knew existed, and a past that refused to stay buried. Daniel followed Bianca through the narrow streets of Barcelona, his footsteps heavy with uncertainty. The city was just as he remembered it, vibrant, bustling, and alive with energy, but it felt different now. More intimate. More real. He had spent years burying this place in the recesses of his mind, treating it like a fleeting memory rather than a part of his past. But now, walking alongside Bianca, it all came rushing back in waves he wasn't sure he could handle. Bianca didn't say much as they walked, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The tension between them was palpable, each step weighed down by a decade of unanswered questions and unspoken words. Daniel stole a glance at her, noticing the way the years had softened her but also made her stronger. She had always been resilient, something that had drawn him to her all those years ago, but now there was a quiet steeliness in her eyes, a strength born from raising a child alone. Finally, they stopped in front of a modest apartment building tucked away on a quiet street. Bianca took a deep breath before turning to him. He's been asking about you since he made that call, she said, her voice laced with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. I told him you might come, but I didn't want to get his hopes up. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. I appreciate that, he said, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to say to him. You don't have to say anything, Bianca replied. Just be there. She led him inside, the faint smell of fresh bread and old books filling the air. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with little touches that spoke of a life well lived despite its challenges. Photos lined the walls, pictures of Matteo at different stages of his life, smiling, laughing, growing. Daniel's gaze landed on one in particular, a faded photo tucked into the corner of a mirror. It was a picture of him, taken during their brief time together, his younger self looking carefree and unburdened. The sight of it sent a jolt through him. Before he could dwell on it, a small voice called from down the hall. Mom? Is he here? Daniel's pulse quickened. Bianca nodded toward the doorway. Go ahead, she said softly. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped into the living room, and there he was, Matteo. The boy stood in the middle of the room, fidgeting slightly, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. Daniel's heart pounded as he took in the sight of his son for the first time, the familiar features, the way he tilted his head just like Daniel did when he was deep in thought. Hi, Daniel said, his voice softer than he intended. You must be Matteo. Matteo nodded, his gaze fixed on him. You're Daniel Morris, he said with a mix of awe and uncertainty. I saw you on TV. Daniel chuckled, feeling a small wave of relief at Matteo's bluntness. Yeah, that's me, he said. But I think you already knew that. Matteo hesitated before stepping closer. Mom says I look like you, he said, studying Daniel's face with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Do you think so? Daniel knelt down to his level, taking a good look at him. Yeah, he said after a moment, his throat tight. I think you do. A small smile tugged at the corners of Matteo's mouth. Do you play chess? He asked suddenly, his eyes lighting up. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, I do. I used to play a lot when I was younger. Matteo grinned and pulled a well-worn chessboard from the shelf. Mom says I'm pretty good, he said proudly. Want to play? Daniel glanced at Bianca, who gave him a slight nod. He moved to the coffee table, sitting down across from Matteo as the boy eagerly set up the pieces. As they played, Daniel found himself marveling at how quickly they fell into an easy rhythm. Matteo was sharp, observant, and had an uncanny ability to anticipate his moves. It was like looking at a younger version of himself. Halfway through the game, Matteo looked up and said, Did you know about me before I called? Daniel felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He glanced at Bianca, who was watching from the kitchen, her expression unreadable. Turning back to Matteo, he said honestly, No, I didn't know. But I should have. Matteo nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Daniel's words carefully. Mom says you're really busy, he said. She said you have a big job and an important life. Daniel swallowed hard. I do, he admitted. But maybe not as important as I thought. Matteo's brow furrowed as he moved upon. Mom's not mad at you, he said quietly. She just gets sad sometimes. I think she missed you. Daniel looked over at Bianca, guilt weighing heavily on him. She caught his gaze and sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel before walking over. I never wanted to ruin your life, Daniel, she said softly. That's why I never told you. I didn't want to be the woman who complicated things for you. Daniel stood, running a hand through his hair. You should have told me, he said, his voice laced with regret. I could have what? Bianca interrupted gently. Left your life behind? Given up your career, your wife? You don't know that, Daniel. He opened his mouth to argue but found himself at a loss for words. She was right. He had been so consumed with building his empire, with proving himself to the world, that he probably wouldn't have done things differently back then. But now it all felt different. As the evening wore on, Daniel found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Matteo's laughter filled the apartment, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a longing for something more meaningful than board meetings and stock prices. When it was time to leave, Daniel knelt down in front of Matteo and ruffled his hair. "I'll see you again soon," he promised, meaning it. Matteo grinned. "You better. I'm gonna beat you at chess next time." Daniel smiled and stood, exchanging a quiet look with Bianca. There was a lot to figure out, a lot to repair, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Daniel realized that the life he had built for himself might not be the one he truly wanted anymore. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change that. Daniel sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the faint city lights flickering beyond the balcony. The sounds of Barcelona buzzed in the distance, but his mind was elsewhere, stuck somewhere between the past he had been running from and the future he was too afraid to face. Meeting Matteo had shaken something deep inside him. The boy's laughter, his curiosity, even the way he furrowed his brow while concentrating on their chess game, all of it lingered in Daniel's mind like an echo he couldn't silence. His phone vibrated on the nightstand, breaking the silence. He reached for it, expecting another update from the office, but his heart sank when he saw Julia's name. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but he knew he couldn't keep running. He swiped to answer, bracing himself. "Hey," he said softly. Julia's voice was cold, distant. "We need to talk." Daniel rubbed his temple, exhaustion pressing in on him. "I know," he admitted. "Julia, I'm sending the papers," she interrupted, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel. I thought I could, but I can't." He felt the weight of her words sink into him, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. "Julia, please. Don't do this over the phone," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Let's talk when I get back." "You should have thought about that before you slept with her," she snapped, then sighed, her voice softening with the weight of exhaustion. "I've tried, Daniel. I really have. But knowing that there's a child you didn't even tell me about when you found out? That's not something I can just move past." Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose, his chest aching. "I didn't know, Julia. I swear. If I had, but you do now." She cut him off, her voice raw. "And you're still there. With them." Daniel swallowed hard, realizing the truth in her words. He had dropped everything to come here, to face the consequences of his actions, and in doing so, he had left Julia behind. "I just needed to see him," he said quietly. "To understand." "And what do you understand now, Daniel?" she asked bitterly. "That you have a son you never knew about? That I'm not enough anymore? That's not fair," Daniel protested, his voice rising. "This isn't about you not being enough. It's about me trying to do the right thing. For once." Julia was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was laced with sorrow. "And what's the right thing, Daniel? Leaving your wife to play dad with a kid you never knew existed? Are you really ready to trade your whole life for him?" He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew she was asking the one question he wasn't ready to face. "You have to choose," Julia continued, her voice trembling. "I can't be part of this. Whatever this is. If you stay, I won't be here when you come back." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the familiar pang of regret settle in his chest. Julia had always been the steady force in his life, the person who stood by him through his relentless pursuit of success. But now she was slipping away. And the worst part was, he couldn't blame her. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said softly. "I love you, Julia." "I know," she whispered. "But love isn't always enough, is it?" There was a long silence between them, filled with things left unsaid. Finally, Julia exhaled sharply. "I'll have the papers sent over in a few days. Please don't fight me on this, Daniel. Just let me go." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Okay," he whispered. The call ended, and Daniel sat motionless, staring at the phone in his hand. The finality of it hit him like a tidal wave. Julia was his past, his carefully constructed, meticulously maintained life. But Matteo was something different. Something unexpected and unplanned, but undeniably real. Later that night, Bianca found him sitting on the small balcony outside his hotel room, staring blankly into the distance. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You okay?" she asked softly. Daniel sighed, rubbing his face. "Julia's leaving me," he said flatly. "She's sending the divorce papers." Bianca's expression shifted, a mixture of sympathy and guilt flashing in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't want this for you." Daniel shook his head. "It's not your fault. It's mine. I made my choices and now I have to live with them." Bianca hesitated before stepping closer. "What are you going to do?" she asked gently. Daniel let out a long breath. "I don't know," he admitted. "My whole life, I've been chasing something, success, money, power. And now I have it all, but it feels hollow." Bianca nodded slowly. "Matteo doesn't need your money, Daniel. He just wants to know you." Daniel looked at her, the truth of her words hitting him hard. He had spent so much time running his company, building his empire, and now, for the first time, he was beginning to wonder if any of it really mattered. "I have to go back to New York," he said finally. "There are things I need to take care of. But I'll be back." Bianca studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I won't stop you this time," she said. "But if you come back, Daniel, it's not just for a visit. It's for good." Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. "I understand," he said. The next morning, as he packed his bags and prepared to leave, Matteo stood by the door, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. "Are you coming back?" Matteo asked, his voice small. Daniel knelt down in front of him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yeah, buddy," he said with a small smile. "I'll be back soon. I promise." Matteo's face brightened a little, and he nodded. "Okay. I'll practice chess until then." Daniel chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "You better. I'm not going easy on you next time." As he walked away, Daniel knew his life would never be the same. He was standing at a crossroads, torn between the life he had built and the one he had unknowingly left behind. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which one he truly belonged to. Daniel sat in the airport lounge, staring at the boarding pass in his hands. New York was calling him back, board meetings, shareholders, and a life that once felt like everything he ever wanted. But now, after the past few days with Matteo, the thought of returning to his old life felt like stepping into a cage he had built for himself. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through photos he had taken with Matteo at the park, at dinner, during their chess games. He let out a deep breath and closed his eyes. He could leave, return to the empire he had spent years building, or he could stay and try to build something new, something real. The weight of the choice pressed against his chest, suffocating and terrifying. With a sudden clarity that felt almost too simple, he stood up, walked to the counter, and cancelled his flight. Hours later, he found himself standing outside Bianca's apartment once again, suitcase in hand. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face, followed by something softer. "You're back," she said, crossing her arms. "I never really left," Daniel said, offering a small smile. "I realized I have nothing waiting for me in New York that matters more than what's here." Bianca studied him for a long moment before stepping aside to let him in. Matteo, who had been sitting on the couch working on homework, looked up in surprise. "You came back!" he exclaimed, jumping up. Daniel grinned. "I did. And I thought maybe we could do something fun." Matteo's eyes lit up. "Can we go to a soccer match? I've never been to one." Daniel exchanged a glance with Bianca, who gave a small nod. "I think we can make that happen," he said, ruffling Matteo's hair. The next few weeks passed in a blur of moments Daniel had never imagined himself enjoying, helping Matteo with his math homework, cheering him on at soccer practice, and learning how to cook simple meals with Bianca in their tiny kitchen. The towering glass skyscrapers and boardrooms of his former life felt distant now, and in their place, a simpler, more fulfilling reality began to take shape. One evening, after putting Matteo to bed, Daniel and Bianca found themselves sitting on the small balcony overlooking the street below. The warm glow of the city lights painted soft shadows on her face, and for the first time in years, they talked, really talked. "I never thought I'd see you like this," Bianca said, swirling the wine in her glass. "The Daniel I remember was always running to the next big thing." Daniel chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I guess I was. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what really matters." He turned to her, his gaze lingering. "I've missed you." Bianca smiled softly but didn't respond right away. She looked down at her hands, then up at him. "You hurt me, Daniel. When you left, I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a moment in time. But it did matter." He reached for her hand hesitantly, relieved when she didn't pull away. "I was a different man back then," he admitted. "I'm not saying I have it all figured out now, but I want to try." Bianca searched his eyes, and after a long pause she nodded. "We'll see," she said with a small smile. Just as the moment settled between them, Daniel's phone buzzed. Julia's name flashed on the screen. He sighed, reluctantly answering the call and stepping inside. "I'm moving forward with the divorce," Julia said without preamble, her voice devoid of any emotion. "The papers will be finalized soon." Daniel closed his eyes, leaning against the counter. "Julia! I never meant for it to end like this." Julia let out a dry laugh. "Did you think it wouldn't? Daniel, you have a child with another woman. There's no coming back from that." "I know," he admitted quietly. I want you to be happy." Julia sighed. "I am. Or at least I will be. But what about you? Are you happy, Daniel? Or are you just running away again?" Daniel looked around Bianca's apartment, at the signs of a life he was slowly becoming a part of. "I think I'm finally starting to figure out what happiness looks like," he said, his voice steady. Julia was silent for a moment, then said, "I hope so. For your sake. Goodbye, Daniel." The line went dead, and Daniel stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone. Julia was right, he had been running for years, but for the first time, he wasn't running away. He was running towards something. Later that night, he sat by Matteo's bedside, watching him sleep peacefully. The boy had no idea how much he had already changed Daniel's life in such a short time. He reached out and gently smoothed Matteo's hair, feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Bianca appeared in the doorway, watching him. "You're good with him," she said quietly. Daniel smiled, his eyes never leaving Matteo. "I want to be." As they stood in the dim light, a quiet understanding passed between them. There was still so much to figure out: his role in Matteo's life, what it meant for his career, and how he could rebuild the trust he had broken with Bianca. But for the first time, Daniel wasn't afraid of the unknown. He had spent a lifetime chasing success, but here, in this tiny apartment with Matteo and Bianca, he realized he had been chasing the wrong thing all along. Success didn't mean boardrooms and headlines. It meant bedtime stories and soccer games, home-cooked meals and quiet conversations on balconies. And with that realization, Daniel knew he didn't want to return to his old life. He wanted to stay, to build something real with his son, and maybe, just maybe, with Bianca too. Daniel stood on the balcony, the early morning sun casting a golden glow over the rooftops of Barcelona. Below, the city was slowly waking up, vendors setting up their stalls, the aroma of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. It felt different now. Familiar. Home. He sipped his coffee, gazing out into the distance, thinking about the decision he had made the night before. He had tossed and turned in bed for hours, wrestling with the enormity of it all. But deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't go back to New York. Not to the endless cycle of meetings, mergers, and money that had consumed his life for so long. He wanted something different. Something real. Later that morning, he sat at the small kitchen table with his laptop open, staring at the email he had drafted for the board. The words stared back at him, final and irrevocable. Subject: resignation as CEO of Morris Enterprises. Daniel hesitated, his fingers hovering over the send button. Years of work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices had built his empire. But what was it worth if he had no one to share it with? He glanced over at Matteo, who was sitting at the table, tongue sticking out in concentration as he colored a picture. Bianca moved around the kitchen, humming softly to herself. With a deep breath, Daniel clicked send. It was done. There was no turning back now. An hour later, his phone rang. He sighed, already knowing who it would be. "Daniel, what the hell is going on?" came the voice of his business partner, Greg, sharp and demanding. "You can't just walk away from everything we've built. The board is losing their minds." Daniel leaned back in his chair, keeping his voice calm. "I've made my decision, Greg. It's time for me to step away." "Step away?" Greg barked. "You're the face of Morris Enterprises. This company is you. You don't just walk away from that." "I already did," Daniel said firmly. "I'm staying here in Spain. There's someone, I need to focus on now." Greg was silent for a moment before letting out a low sigh. "This about that kid?" "Yes," Daniel admitted. "It is." Greg's voice softened slightly. "Look, I get it, but think about this. You're giving up billions, Daniel. Do you really think you can just start over?" "I'm not starting over," Daniel said, his voice unwavering. "I'm finally starting." The call ended with Greg's frustration still ringing in Daniel's ears, but for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. Free. Later that day, he met Bianca at a cafe down the street. She was sitting at an outdoor table, stirring her coffee slowly, her expression cautious but curious. "You're really doing this?" she asked, eyeing him over the rim of her cup. "Walking away from everything?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah. I sent the email this morning. I'm done." Bianca let out a slow breath, setting down her cup. "And what happens when the excitement fades? When you start missing the life you left behind?" "I won't," Daniel said simply. "This is where I need to be." Bianca studied him for a long moment. "I want to believe you," she said softly. "But you left once before. What's different now?" Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Because I know what I'd be leaving behind this time," he said. "And I'm not willing to make that mistake again." She nodded slowly, her eyes searching his for any hint of hesitation. "Matteo, he's getting attached to you. I need to know you're not going to disappear again." "I won't," Daniel promised. "And to prove it, I did something." Bianca arched an eyebrow. "What did you do?" Daniel pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "I bought something. A small bookstore, just a few blocks from here." Bianca blinked in surprise. "A bookstore?" He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I know how much you love books. And I figured you could run it. Make it your own." She opened the envelope and scanned the paperwork inside, her fingers trembling slightly. "Daniel, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said. "Let's build something here. Together." Tears welled up in Bianca's eyes, and for the first time since he had come back, Daniel saw something in her gaze he hadn't seen in years: hope. "I don't know if I can forgive everything overnight," she admitted. "But I think I'd like to try." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "That's all I'm asking." Over the next few weeks, Daniel fully immersed himself in their new life. He spent mornings helping Bianca set up the bookstore, afternoons picking Matteo up from school, and evenings reading bedtime stories. He found a strange comfort in the simplicity of it all: no corporate dinners, no urgent emails, just life. Real, messy, beautiful life. Matteo beamed with pride every time they visited the bookstore together. "Mom's gonna be famous," he declared one day, flipping through a book. "She's the best at picking stories." Daniel grinned, ruffling his hair.